Welcome to the Edgar Allan Poe podcast with your co-hosts Vicky Ray, Nez, and Keith Chowgo. Exploring book to screen and everything in between, delving into the dark despair and the sinister world of Edgar Allan Poe.
Hello, welcome to Literary License Podcast, and today we're discussing Edgar Allan Poe's Murder in the Rue Morgue, which was written by Edgar Allan Poe, of course, and the 1932 Universal classic starring Bela Lugosi, Murders in the Rue Morgue. So let's find out who's with us. Today we have a special guest co-host, which is Angela Dyson, the author of The Love Agency. Hello, Angela.
Actually, hello, darling. It's The Love Detective. But hello.
Sorry, Love Detective.
Love Detective. Hello, everybody. And Keith, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here and very much looking forward to discussing Edgar Allan Poe.
And all our listeners out there, have you been subscribing to our newsletter? Thank you, all you 800,000 some odd people at the moment.
No, where'd y'all come from?
As you know, that we've been mentioning Angela Dyson's books for the last 3 months, so go out there and buy it. It's one of my favorites, and I loved it. I did. I
downloaded it on my Kindle last night, and I'm going to start reading it because I'm so sick of TV. I need some good material.
It's fantastic, and I'm not just saying that because you're here.
He has been singing your praises. He's not lying.
I'm so thrilled. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how it's just such a joy when people like what you do. And it often comes at a time when you feel like a bit low in spirit. So when you do hear something wonderful, it just makes life so much better. So thank you.
Well, after finally meeting you, I can see where the energy comes from. So it'll be good.
Then, of course, who else we got with us is Vicky Ray, which you've heard her tones flowing through the airwaves. Hello, Vicky.
Hi, Keith. I missed you too.
And of course, we have Rod Laby, who loves Edgar Allan Poe, is one of our favorite persons who loves old-time horror films. Hello, Rod. How are you?
Thank you. Rod is the ultimate person that gets us off on our tangents.
Well, I try.
Tangent Rod.
I go off on tangents, but I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to meet everybody who's new, and I'm anxious to hear about your book, to find out how you got a publisher interested in all that stuff, because I have a book myself, 2 books now that are just sitting in my hard drive gathering dust. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It'll be a fun time.
We're very fun.
If you think a vicious murder involving an ape is fun, okay, then we're going to do this.
There is that.
So now we've come to the portion of our episode where we'd like to talk about our roses and thorns, what we liked this week and what we disliked this week. And I'm going to start with Vicky, because Vicky always has the most fun ones.
I don't have many fun ones because I was kind of down and out for about 10 days anyway. But I'm not even going to discuss, the bad stuff. We all know what the bad stuff is, so everybody knows the stick up my backside is this week. I'm so tired of hearing of misery and death and everything else. I want our lives back. I want us all to be happy again and productive and healthy. So I concentrated on TV like the rest of us probably have and books. But I finished the first 4 or 5 episodes of Westworld, season 3. I'm kind of liking it. It's pretty good. It's like got a lot of woman power too. That's why all the women are badasses. That's why I just love it. And I got hooked on The Spanish Princess. Don't know why, but I started watching it and I couldn't stop watching it. And then there was the fun thing in the middle of the night in my insomnia and coughing, Zombieland Double Tap. Couldn't stop watching it. Terrible movie, fun as hell. But other than that, I just all I care about is everybody I know and love and all our listeners, and I want everybody to be happy and healthy. It's all I care about this week.
And what about yourself, Rod? What is your rose and thorn of the week?
Well, I'm like Vicky in the sense that that's all we've been hearing is gloom and doom about the coronavirus, and I go out maybe once a day, keep my social distancing, but I don't walk around with a mask on my face. I will say that. But I need to go grocery shopping, and I only go out when I absolutely need to. And being home and being the only one here, I've been watching a lot of. I have my cats here, and
there you go.
They're a handful, but I've been watching a lot of movies. I just got finished watching House of Dark Shadows again, and
I love that movie.
Really, I liked it too. But I really saw a lot of mistakes in that movie. A lot of mistakes. But a friend of mine had wanted me to watch, and he had given this to me about 6 months ago, and it was in my car, and I never brought it in the house. It was called Anguish, and it had that actress who was in Poltergeist who kept saying, "The house is clean."
Yeah.
Zelda
I don't know what her
Rubinstein.
name is.
Zelda Rubinstein.
Yeah, that was her. It was called
oh my God.
Anguish. Anguish is the name of this movie, and it was.
I got that movie on DVD. I like that film about the eyeball.
I thought it was good. Yeah, I thought it was. When I started to watch it, I go, "Oh, this is sleaze." The cheap sleaze, and living with a dominating mother, who's this woman on top of that, and she kept saying, "Come home, come home." She was telepathically connected to her son, who she sent out on murderous sprees to cut people's eyeballs out, which was shown in loving detail.
I can't do eyeballs. I can do anything but eyeballs.
Yeah,
man.
but the weird thing about it is, it was a movie. It was a movie that people were watching in a movie theater. And that's when it suddenly took a bizarre turn, but it was really quite well done. They did make some mistakes. There was a young lady who was there watching the movie with a friend, and she said, "Oh, this movie's making me sick. I have to go to the bathroom." And she went in the bathroom, and there were urinals in the bathroom, which I thought was rather odd for a 15-year-old girl to be going into a men's room.
You gotta go. You gotta go.
Right, and then later on,
always got the smallest lines.
Yes, there was nobody in there. There was a killer who was influenced by the movie, and he was supposed to be in the lobby by himself, and he walked by a poster that had a glass, covering over it, and you clearly saw the reflection of 2 or 3 other people right behind him. So that was a little mistake, because he was supposed to be by himself. But I really enjoyed it. So, and then I watched Heredity, which had been told to me had been played up quite a bit, and I didn't like that movie at all. I really disliked it.
I was going to watch it. I guess I won't. If you don't like it, Rod, then I'm probably.
Well, you're going to have to watch it, Vicky, because we're doing military and Midsummer, and the director's going to be with us, so you better watch it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. There you are. There you have it.
That's why it was recommended, was because of Midsummer, and so I had heard so much about Midsummer. Well, I've never seen it. But then I popped this one in, and it was only $5 at Walmart. So, and I thought, okay, I like Toni Collette, and she was really good in The Sixth Sense, and she does a lot of interesting things, but I didn't like her in this movie at all. I can't even make sense of it when I'm thinking back on it, and that was just a couple of days ago. It didn't stay with me. But when I posted that on Facebook, of course, the people came out of the woodwork saying it's great, it's a wonderful example of modern horror. It's just too old, yada, 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 whatever. I guess I am too old, but at least I understand quality.
We love you, Rod.
Thank you. And I am in that age group for this coronavirus, so I have to be, but I don't have any lung conditions or any kind of underlying things like that.
There's an older person that had it, and I think you'll be all right, because a lot of people are coming out of it, so. Just
there was a 93-year-old who came out of it.
Be your natural introvert self. You'll be fine.
Absolutely.
So, what about you, Angela? What have yours been your roses and thorns this week?
Well, one of my roses this week is not film related, it's alcohol related, which is always fun. We've got something we're calling now the quarantini.
I've seen that. Oh my God! I gotta try that.
It's such a joy. It's basically you make a cocktail of your choice with whatever drinks you've got sort of lurking in the back of the drinks cupboard. So I had a Zoom meeting with some of my friends last night. We all had our quarantinis in hand, and actually, I make a bloody good dry martini. I've got to tell you. I was very it was strong. It was strong. So that has been a definite rose. But in terms of you chaps say movies, I say films. What I've not been wanting to watch, whether it's television or films, is anything depressing. I've been wanting to watch things that make me feel happy and give me some escape. So I dug out one of my favorite films, which you'll probably think is very silly, but I love it. Private Benjamin with Golden.
I love that movie.
I love that film.
I love it.
Such a feel-good film.
It really is.
Love it. And I must have seen it. I have seen it so many times, and it's one of those films that just to me it just doesn't date. It's joyful. She is just so likable, isn't she?
And they had such good chemistry because they were such good friends in real life.
That's right. Well, I've read that, and I just I loved it. And it really, that and a quarantini, got to say.
There you go.
Well, I have to tell you, that movie, I went to the movies to see that. That was like 1980, so I'm dating myself. But that had one of the funniest scenes I have ever seen in a movie where they put the dye in the shower head.
Oh, my God, yes.
Shower.
And she's blue, and she doesn't. She really?
She spits up all this blue. And I thought, oh, my, this is so funny. And now, did you know that not long after that movie was made, that she, and I think she was nominated for an Oscar for that part, Eileen Brennan.
She was.
Best supporting actress.
Eileen Bernstein, yeah.
Right.
Eileen Brennan.
They were walking somewhere, and Eileen Brennan got hit by a car right in front of Goldie Hawn, and she was severely injured. She walked off the curb, or a car hit the curb or something, and she was crippled by it.
Yeah, that's true.
For a long while.
Because doesn't she?
I don't even know if she made any more movies.
Well, didn't she play, in Will and Grace? And which I absolutely love. Yeah. And Jack McFarlane, who I think is just like, I wish he was real. It probably is real in a way. But doesn't that lovely actress play his drama teacher? And she's really bad-tempered.
Yes, she did. She made other movies. She was in Jeepers Creepers. I remember that.
She was in that.
And she was in Clue. I think she was in Clue, the movie Clue.
Yes, she was in Clue. Oh, she was in Jeepers Creepers. Now, was that her?
Yeah, that was her.
She was like the crazy old lady.
It was. Oh my God, yeah, okay.
So
the monsters went after men.
They're my roses. Thorns, a bit like Vicky, I'm trying to ignore them. I suppose one thorn this week is hearing that there are people who are exploiting this terrible situation.
Yes, there's always going to be somebody, right?
People knocking on elderly ladies' doors, demanding money to inspect their property and stuff like that. But I'm thinking I'm going back to my Private Benjamin and my quarantine.
Exactly.
Well, my roses and thorns this week. My thorns basically is people who don't self-isolate. I'm sorry, but basically, if self-isolation does not include self-obsession or selfish. So get out there and self-isolate. Join your community, help keep everyone safe. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
And wait, one more thing. If you're going into the store, just bring one person. Don't bring all of your children into the store. Please, just one person, one cart.
But my rose has to be the Netflix series Unorthodox. It's a story about a Hasidic Jewish woman who escapes her marriage and goes to Berlin. And it sounds really depressing, but the performances are fantastic. It goes back and forth in time. So basically you see the beginning of her marriage, and they could have done it so that the guy the Hasidic Jew male that she marries could have been really horrible, but they don't do that. They play this really nice delicate line. And at the end of the day, you're like soaring for her, and it just makes you feel really good.
And repeat the name of that?
Unorthodox.
Netflix?
Netflix. It's 4 episodes.
Oh, it's 4. Okay.
You start watching it. It's done in they speak in English, German, and Hebrew. So fantastic.
Subtitles?
I highly recommend that. Sometimes, depending if they're speaking English or not. So if they're speaking English, no. If they're speaking German, yeah. Is it a knock? So that's, I have to say that was actually the highlight of my television viewing. And of course, Westworld. I think it's just fantastic series, and I love the new direction. So what that does now is that brings us to, we have joined forces with the Story Geek podcast, and what they've given you to, while everyone's out there self-isolating, as a good person should, are going to give you the top stuff to watch that is available through streaming and available at your home, so you never have to leave. Take it away, Story Geek.
What movies can you watch right now? I'm Jay Shear, host of the Story Geeks podcast, and here are the movies and some TV shows you can watch right now from home. New to streaming services this week, if you're willing to rent or buy, check out The Current War, the director's cut, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch as Thomas Edison, Michael Shannon as George Westinghouse, and Nicholas Hoult as Nikola Tesla, a fantastic cast. It's a movie about business and electricity, and has a 55 on Metacritic. Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, also came out this week. As someone who's deep into the Star Wars fandom, this movie was released to a needless amount of controversy. But if you're looking for a big blockbuster with plenty of special effects, this fits the bill. It has a 53 on Metacritic. 1917 also comes out. Sam Mendes' movie about family and friendship during World War I garnered a bunch of Oscar buzz. Unfortunately, it didn't win a ton of those Oscars. But it's still one of my favorite films from 2019 and well worth a watch. It has a 78 on Metacritic, which is a fantastic score. My personal recommendations for content on Netflix this week all have the word king in them. First up, Tiger King. Come on, it's a cultural phenomenon at this point. Tiger King is must-see TV. If you haven't seen it yet, watch it at least so that you can understand all your friends' memes on social media. It's a compelling, funny, and shocking docuseries from Netflix. And also, The Letter to the King. While Tiger King might be too adult for the whole family, The Letter to the King is a fantastic new fantasy series on Netflix that's far more family-friendly. It does have some young adult tropes, but it's done really well. If your kids like Harry Potter, they'll probably love this too. I highly recommend it. If you're looking for things on Disney Plus, I highly recommend the Disney Imagineering docuseries if you haven't seen that yet. It goes into the story of the Walt Disney Company and the parks that have brought so much joy to so many people. And another show suitable for the entire family, Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls is one of the best television series on Disney Plus. And parents and kids will both love it. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's hilarious, heartwarming, and incredibly creative. It's about two 12-year-old twin siblings who go to live in their Grunkle Stan's roadside attraction house, only to discover that the mysteries surrounding the house are real. And coming to Disney Plus this Friday, Pixar's Onward comes to streaming early. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. My pick for the week? Well, if you're looking for something for the whole family, watch Gravity Falls. Yes, it's animated, but trust me, it's worth your time. It may be my favorite animated series of all time. If you're looking for something more adult-oriented, it has to be Tiger King. But if you need something Oscar-worthy, 1917 gets the call. Our latest The Story Geeks podcast is all about Universal's classic monster movies and their remakes. From Frankenstein to The Creature from the Black Lagoon, check out The Story Geeks podcast on your preferred podcast provider. Until next week, this has been Jay Shear from The Story Geeks, and I hope you have fun streaming movies and TV shows at home.
Hello, welcome back to Literary License Podcast, and now we're going to discuss Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, which is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, which was first published in the Grams magazine in 1841. It has been described as the first modern detective story. Poe referred to it as one of the tales of Rash in the Cash Nation. I'm sure I Killed that word for you.
He did.
Folks. See, Augustin Dupin is a man in Paris who solves the mystery of the brutal murder of 2 women. Numerous witnesses heard a suspect, though no one agrees on what language was spoken. At the murder scene, Dupin finds a hair that does not appear to be human. As the first detective story, Poe's Dupin displays many traits which becomes literary conventions and subsequent fictional detective series, including Sherlock Holmes and Hero Perot. Many later characters, for example, followed Poe's model for the brilliant detective, his personal friend who serves as narrator, and the final revelation being presented before the reasoning that leads up to it. Dupin himself reappears in The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter. So Poe did write sequels, which I never knew until we did.
I didn't either until I started reading about this, and it's like, oh wow, your first detective stories, you know.
So. And now that I've given you a quick synopsis, so left Vicky off in the lurch, we're going to start with Angela. She could tell us what she thought of Murders in the Rue Morgue.
To be brutally honest, I didn't love it. I'm sorry. I had read a little bit of Poe when I was in my teenage years. And so it was wonderful to have the opportunity to go back and revisit something. And I wondered if my attitude would have changed. And to be honest, it hadn't. But there's a great deal of merit in him. He's very atmospheric. It's highly sensationalized. But I also see that as it was serialized for the Graham magazine, that makes absolute sense. And of course, I have to remember that it is a product of its time. Exactly. But I also have to say, a personal thank you to Edgar Allan Poe, because, he, as you've just said, Keith, he is the person that created the sort of the literary convention for the amateur sleuth, the original detective story. So as I write sort of comic thrillers, which sounds very odd, but I do, I'm very grateful to him. And what I find fascinating is the introduction of the gentleman detective. Now, although obviously this is an American writer, a Victorian American writer, and I don't know much about American politics in the 19th century, but in Britain, where the class system was absolutely rabid, and to a point still is, sadly, the police, for example, were considered, they were considered definitely not gentlemen. They were a little better than tradesmen, which is how they would have been seen.
Really?
Yeah. So they were
they're kind of scullery lads, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And they would have to, if they were knocking on a Victorian door of a grand house in central London, they would not be allowed in by the butler or the footman. They would have to use the tradesman's entrance. So, basically like a servant. That's what they were seeing, very little better than servants. So the idea of Victorian attitude was that's why the gentleman's sleuth is so much brighter, so much cleverer. He can use logic. Obviously, it's never a her, is it? But he can use logic step by step to get to the root of the problem. Whereas the poor old plodding policeman is too dumb. This is the conceit behind it. So it is fascinating. And again, as you mentioned, Keith, the sort of rather artless friend or companion or narrator in this particular case, who is there as a sort of to keep a distance for the reader from the main protagonist, but also, I think, to kind of make it slightly more human. One of the fascinating things about this particular story is it's very much about logic. We've got rather endless details on the locked room and the windows, etc. But what I thought was fascinating, and where he differs from Conan Doyle, who comes later, for example, is that there's a reference to Dupin having an ability to mind read and to see into the soul. And I think that very much reflects the 19th century fascination with both science and technology, but also with the occult. Yeah. So there's a few things to chuck at you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The occult.
I have to say that when I read it, I found what was quite interesting is that you get the first third of the book is kind of like a very odd introduction into this world that you're about to enter. And it was kind of like, for me, it was a bit pretentious, actually.
It was killing me.
But then it's kind of then Poe does this thing that we kind of get, because as we read, here we are, I think, September, October, November, December, January, February, March. Here we are in March at the moment, or April So we've actually read 8 Edgar Allan Poe stories so far. And I
Right.
noticed that they tend to range from pretension to the way that their pretensive narrative to a everyman narrative. And I thought it was quite interesting. We start out with this pretentious narrative of Poe's, and then what we do is we find ourselves in this everyman narrative when we start getting into the murders and interviewing it. But I think the problem with this story for me is that there was no emotional resonance. It's kind of like you're kind of seeing something very clinical. It was very clinically led story. And and I think that has to do with the Victorian attitude because it's written from and this is what I find interesting, that I find if Poe's writing about an everyman, like in Telltale Heart or something like this, then there's the everyman sort of thing. There seems to be a lot more heart. But then when you write something from a rich person's, whether it's Fall of the House of Ushers or something of that ilk, then what we kind of do is we get this distancing because the person's so aristocratic that he's lacks of emotion, and it's all about blah 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 sort of thing. And I think that's where the story kind of suffers me a little bit, because I'm kind of reading it. It's like, okay, it's interesting. I did like the gore. I thought, oh God, well, this is quite good, sort of thing.
True.
And he does have a habit of mentioning the severed head quite a few times through the narrative.
He did.
But the guy was a bit too pompous to actually become a likable character that you actually rooted for. It got to the point where it's just like, you're kind of reading it. Yeah, it was interesting. And then there's like, it's almost like a bunch of round pegs trying to be shoved into square holes.
He was condescending.
Arrogant.
Yeah. And I also found that the whole plot and the reasoning behind it, everything did feel like a bunch of round pegs being slammed into square holes, because the orangutan thing didn't feel realistic enough. The reasoning behind it was kind of, because you really don't understand why the orangutan went to these two women's house with a razor and did what he did.
True.
Because at the end of it, what we get at the end of the story is that, okay, it was an orangutan that escaped from the sailor. That's it. So it's like,
Can I ask you a couple of things? Because I thought several things you said that were really interesting. You were saying about the sense that the richer characters lack sympathy. And I'm just wondering if that's anything to do with Edgar Allan Poe's own personal experience, his life. Because his parents died, they were actors. His parents died when he was 3, and he was fostered but not officially adopted by a prosperous.
And on top of that, his mother and his wife died.
Yes, but I think
his sister as well. I think
the rich family that fostered him sort of let him go. They put him in a good school, but when he went to university, he only lasted a year because there wasn't sufficient funds for him to be able to continue. And he also went to West Point, and again, there wasn't enough money. So
he had such a sad life, actually.
He did, and he's got a very sad face, I think.
He does.
Yeah.
I think so, too.
I mean, he did suffer apparently from depression and had a history of alcoholism. And he died.
Was he addicted to morphine as well?
Was it morphine too?
Morphine as well,
He
yeah.
died at 40. So
I think as far as his being in West Point, I don't know if they changed the policy, but the person doesn't pay anything. They're committed to 5 years in the American Army.
Really? I
after
didn't know that.
Yeah, that they have to be recommended by a legislator or a senator, I believe. And so when they get recommended, it's a full boat, but you have to commit yourself to 5 years as a second lieutenant in the American Army. They may have changed that, but what I read as far as Poe was concerned, this was years ago, was that he was just a ne'er-do-well. He disappointed his sponsor, and he wasn't manning up. He was ignoring his responsibilities, and he was just a writer, and that was completely dismissed. That was not in the real world. That had no practical benefits whatsoever. And of course, he wasn't making money off from this really. So what he was doing was. But I have a question for all of you who have read the story. Mm-hmm. This is something I can't figure out. I know that he was the. What happens is they go back to the scene of the crime, and they expect somehow, which I must have missed, that the perpetrator of the crime would return to the scene of the crime, which he did. The sailor does, but when Lupin, I think it was his name, starts talking about how the ape got in and out of the apartment, it had to do with a hidden spring that had to be released somehow to open the window.
It was a nail that looked like it was actually nailed shut, but it actually wasn't nailed shut because basically from what my recollection is that basically the spring was in there, so the nail kept the window there. But the thing is, if you hit the window a certain way, the window would spring up but keep the nail in its place, and then when the window closed, the nail would go back, which
so did it just
it's one of those things where you're kind of going, well, and you're kind of working this out in your mind. But for me, normally, anytime that I've had a nail in a window with renting flats in England, sometimes it's a bit questionable. But whenever the window goes up and the nail falls down, and that's what's securing the window, you find yourself around the floor looking for that nail to put it back in. So that didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, that did happen, and the nail was broken. He says it. He says he went to grab the nail head, and it came out with part of the nail stuck to it, and the rest was still in the wood. And he said this has happened a long time before because both ends are rusted. So it wasn't something that had just been done. But what I want to know is who activated the spring to open the window. Now that sounds like a calculated effort to do, unless in the course of him throwing these bodies around and wrecking the place, that something banged into the window and flew it out, made it fly open on its own. Because if you remember rightly, the old lady's body is found outside,
right,
on the ground. And when they talk about at the end, when they're talking, when the sailor is explaining what happened, he said he chased the orangutan. It ran into this place, and he ran up and looked in and couldn't believe what he was seeing, and then he just left. Okay.
What about the arguing, though? Remember that there's banter supposedly going on.
He didn't argue. All he said was "mon Dieu," which is an expression of shock, right? Well, at what he's seeing, and he ran out. And this other thing, the orangutan was making these sounds, guttural noises. It wasn't a language at all. But what I want to know is, it said that as he was watching and the ape turned around and saw him watching and became afraid that he was going to get punished, he started trying to get rid of the evidence of what he had done. So he shoved the woman up the fireplace, and he took the body of the woman and threw her out. Well, how did he throw her out? Through what? A closed window?
It doesn't really say, do they?
Well, see, that's why I say that's why this detective story is a bunch of round holes put into square. Bunch of round pegs put in square pegs, because he's kind of shoving these things. And the thing is, when you read it the first time and you don't think about it, it's like fine, you kind of accept it. But then when you start thinking about it, you can actually pick it apart. And this is where I think that Doyle and Poe were actually good friends. In real life. Yeah, and I think that Doyle and there's something went on with their relationship that they stopped becoming friends. And I think this might have the fact that I think Doyle was able to perfect this and think of the plots a little bit better and make sure that they were more iron tight. And because I think that Poe started it, but I think that Doyle was able to finish it. Because I think that I think it's very interesting that we have Poe in this writing a murder mystery sort of thing, with your and it does fit. We have the criteria. I mean, Agatha Christie, made a whole career out of this. A bunch of interesting, weird kind of characters all gathered around, and who's the murder kind of plot. And we get shadows of that, but it's not a fully understood version of that kind of story.
Yeah, it's the precursor.
It's like the precursor. It's like the first time anything like this has been done, so it's not really perfected. And and I also think that when you look at the different languages, that is basically Poe dissecting Victorian culture at that time, because basically you have the English Victorian, which is pure gentleman, which is kind of par with the Paris Victorian gentleman, though Paris think themselves more refined than the English, and the English think themselves more refined than the Parisians. Meanwhile, then you have the Spanish, which are basically just the common man, the dirt of the soil of the earth. They're looked bad upon, and all the other countries that he mentions there, and the way that they all can't understand each other, but that's basically showing out what the class system is within
sort of like the Tower
Europe.
of Babel on a micro scale.
Yeah, but it's Victorian Europe. That's the way that all the countries didn't get on with each other. Every country thought they were better than the other, and Paris and England were quite lucky because they were almost on par with each other, but not quite. But all the other European countries, they did look down upon them, and that's what you get. So that's why they couldn't recognize each other's language and if you notice, it's like the Parisians said that there's this, the Spanish dialect that was being used is like a guttural and the way that he explains that.
Animalistic.
And they do say we didn't understand the language, does not speak the language, but understood the inflections. Now, I don't know how you can understand, it said English. Now, how could you understand an English inflection when you don't know how to speak English and you're really kind of unfamiliar with I wouldn't be able to tell. Maybe I might be able to tell Russian. I might be able to tell German.
Right.
I think German was one of the ones he used.
I'm not sure I can understand orangutan, though.
No.
But I'm pretty sure I can't do it.
Well, I think that when it comes to languages anyway, it's like, okay, maybe you wouldn't be able to differentiate the Finnish and the Swedish from the German because they're both dramatic.
Yeah.
But you can pretty much tell the difference between a Spanish and a French accent. You know what I mean? Because because, just kind of the inflection. I know Italians are a bit more expressive, and which this is another thing that Poe kind of gets slightly wrong, because I'm sorry, but I think that if you're a German person and he does a German person talking about a Swedish person and not being able to recognize the accent, I think that if your language is pretty close to what you're speaking, I think you should be able to guess. You might not get to pinpoint the country, but I think pinpoint the dialect.
I suppose
and none of them are able to pinpoint dialect.
I suppose what it is as well, we are so much more exposed to people from different cultures and different countries. Whereas, in 19th century, the people were considered strange if they came from a different town, let alone a different.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, of course.
So that their worlds were so much smaller. But yes, I completely agree with you, Keith. It is flawed. But that's one of the things I like about it is there's a kind of gusto, isn't there? I mean, there's a lot of energy that propels the story along. And then, yes, because it's serialized, you have a slight repeat. But that sort of gusto, maybe slightly too bloodthirsty a gusto, comes through. And I don't know if I'm just imagining this, but I think I would quite like Edgar Allan Poe. I've got a feeling I'd like him. That I'd be quite happy. I'd quite like to sit and have dinner with him and have a conversation with him. What do you guys?
I wouldn't invite him to a party because I think he'd probably bring it down.
He's a Debbie Downer.
Yeah, he might. That's true. And also, your booze cupboard, your alcohol cupboard might be sort of stolen from. But yeah, he obviously was a man of great imagination, great flair.
The most talented people are the most tortured for some reason.
Yeah, but you know what I also think that Poe has is that he has so much passion.
Yes.
And no matter what you read, even the murderers, there's something passionate about everything. And the way he lived his life was passionate. I mean, if you were referring to his life, I mean, the love for his wife was passionate. When she died, it's a passionate afterlife love affair that he still has. Yes. And so, what I quite like about Poe, that whatever he does feel, everything's turned up to 150 degrees. Yes. What the emotions are.
That's what I meant about gusto. You feel it. The story just sort of rocks along, and I really like that.
It did. It's the reveal. The reveal of this is what happened. Like it establishes what happened based upon the eyewitness accounts, which these two men were not eyewitnesses to it, and then also the police and everybody who came there and answered the call, and that's put out for our interpretation as well, which we have to go by what they say. There were two people there. One of them was French. The other one was some foreigner. And then these horrible murders happened. How did they get in? How did they get out? What was the reason for it? There doesn't seem to be any reason, considering there were bags of gold in the room that they could have easily have stolen, and they didn't. And so it was a crime of passion more than anything else. But really, it wasn't passion. The thing was just trying to imitate his friend who was shaving. That's what I thought was more interesting. And come on, I thought the reaction of somebody owning an orangutan, a gigantic animal that's strung like this, they just kind of said, "Oh, you can come pick him up anytime you want." I mean, it's like, what?
Yeah.
This is like a thing that belongs in a zoo or freed out in the African wild.
Preferably
I
free.
mean,
But see, I think this is where the story does suffer, is using the thing of the orangutan, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, that at this time that there wasn't live wild beasts, like we didn't really have the zoo sort of thing. They would find the animal, they would stuff it, and then put it into a museum, and that's how you looked at animals.
Oh God!
Well, that's how you do it. I mean, you can, if you go here to the Natural History Museum here in London, which is a Victorian museum, all the animals are stuffed. They're all Victorian animals that are stuffed, and that's how you saw the zoos came out later. The zoos came out around the 1900s, and that's when they used to bring live animals and put them in cages. But at this time, so I think that's probably the reason why when you have the orangutan, there's a lot of misinformation about the orangutan. That they're gray. Orangutans are not gray. Right. And this is the whole story here hangs on that the orangutan is gray.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, and I'm going orangutan. They kept saying gray hair, and I'm just like, what's not right here?
Yeah, and the way the orangutan moves, the orangutan doesn't move that way. It moves slightly differently. It swings, but the from what I've because I did some little bit of research on the orangutan, and to be honest, I think Poe was actually describing a gorilla.
Exactly.
A gorilla.
But I think that Poe, for the purposes of his story, I think he liked the word orangutan.
It looked like the way it was spelled. So
I think so. I think because he does like words, he likes wordplay. He does, that's what Poe does. He likes wordplay within his stories, and that's why orangutan sounds better than gorilla. So I thought maybe that's why.
I'm just wondering, when you get to the meat of the story, though, I mean, it's the first 2 or 3 pages. I know some was it like 40 pages, something like that. This particular story.
It just seemed like 40.
I love Poe, and I was suffering and struggling through the first beginning of it when he's doing the analysis, like quantum analysis or whatever, what he was doing. And for some reason, I struggled through that. And then finally, boom, there's the story. After you get through this quantum analysis explanation.
Well, who it reminded me of? The relationship between the guy who solves the crime and his friend, the one who's telling the story, is that they're obsessed with this kind of thing. They don't even want to go out in the sunshine. They want it to be night all the time, so they close the curtains and light tapers and pretend it's night until it actually does become night. Then they go walking the streets arm in arm, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of the characters in Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, where he comes over, what's his name? Can you remember the actor's name? Hugh Cronin comes over with some new way of killing, the father, and they discuss the methods of death to the point where the daughter gets upset about it. So they struck me as the same kind of people that were telling the story. But an orangutan, correct me if I'm wrong, is that like the animal that's in those Clint Eastwood movies?
Yeah, Right Turn, Clyde. Yeah, that one.
He's an orangutan.
That's an orangutan.
That's orangutan.
But they do have great strength. They all have. Even a little chimp.
They can rip a man apart. Easy. Yeah.
Well, they rip the face off that woman.
I mean, I think that the problem with this story is it kind of reminds you, have you ever seen that classic story about that movie from the 70s called Murder by Death, which is written by Neil Simon, where basically they get all the greatest detectives. So basically you have, instead of like Miss Marple, it's Jessica Marbles, and it's got Maggie Smith, David Niven, Alex Guinness, Eileen Brennan, she's in it, Peter Falk, and they're playing like
it's a great movie, actually.
It's a spoof of all these people. And Truman Capote's in it as well. And what he does is basically, without giving too much away, is that the reason why he's invited them in because they had a way of like giving you this twist ending that didn't make any sense to the plot, so he wanted to pay them back for this.
Right.
And even though that Christie did it every once in a while, and Conan did it very rarely. But Poe here is considered in bad taste to sit there. What you should do is when you're reading a detective novel, that by the time you get to the end, it should all make sense, and you should go, oh yeah. And then after you finish reading it, you put it down and go, okay, this makes sense. This all goes together. I can understand how this plot goes there. Where in this,
Right.
it doesn't make sense. You get a twist ending and it's thrown at you. It's a bit like having a murder mystery, and you got all these people there, and Uncle Alfred's been killed, and you have, the relatives and the servants there, and it basically wasn't any of them. It was some postman that was, just, driving by one night. And so therefore this postman doesn't appear until the last 5 pages. And that's kind of what we get with this story.
Yes,
right.
People feel shortchanged by that. I think they really do.
Smidge.
But, I mean, it's fascinating for me because writing what I do, and I'm not an author that plots in advance. So, which is kind of running by the seat of my pants quite a lot. So I don't actually know who the real baddie is, or even what the full crime is, till I'm halfway through. So then I have to make sure I go back and weave everything, because I find that for me, it works better to sort of let it happen organically and new ideas just come in. But yeah, so there are times when I've thought, oh my God, what, who bloody did it?
See, when I write scripts, I write scripts the opposite. What I do is I plot everything out, and then basically what I do is I write it out in long form, but not like a story, but kind of like bits and pieces sort of thing. And then what I do is I take Post-it notes and I have like plot lines everywhere, so that way I can keep track, because I have a difficult time going, remembering what's going on sort of thing as I'm going forward.
Well, it's actually a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, it's very anal retentive. That's what it is. I mean, but I find that people who write like yourself, Angela, there's another author that writes exactly the same way, and that's Fanny Flagg. She writes that, and she's someone but I think that when you do write that way, I think what you do is you get this emotional flow and this emotional heart to characters. Where if you do it the other way, now John Irving, who I've actually interviewed on a couple of occasions, he writes differently. He writes the end first, then writes the beginning, and goes back and forth till he gets to the middle.
That would make me
I've never heard of that. Oh my God, that's fascinating.
How hard would that be to do?
He knows how he knows exactly how the ending is, and then he writes the beginning, and then he's working out how the ending is going to happen, which is quite interesting. And he still gets an emotional core. But then if you
very clever. I can't. I suppose what it is, you become very ingrained in working in your own way, and it becomes what's natural. But I mean, I'm lost in admiration for somebody like that, because that to me seems almost impossible. I just don't think I could do it at all.
Yeah.
I really wouldn't know how to do it.
Well, you all are writers, and I'm not. I'm just fascinated with how you all just do this. I mean, I just love that you guys have these brains, and you can, take all the stuff and put it together, because I wouldn't even know how to begin.
But Doyle writes the same way, like what I said. He plots everything out very, very carefully. And if you read Greystoke, it's plotted very, very carefully. Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, because that's what he did before he did Sherlock Holmes.
Okay, we're back to we got monkeys again.
Back to monkeys again. Yep.
Lord of the Rings. Maybe that's the reason why there's here, because of his relationship with Conan Doyle. But if you do read Conan Doyle, I find that there is a kind of when you read Sherlock Holmes or any of Doyle's book, and he does plot this way out, that there is a bit of disconnect sometimes with the story. Where Agatha Christie was the kind of person who wrote the opposite way. She wrote like you do. And then there's always a lot more heart within the characters, and there's a lot more feeling with the characters. Like Dickens did the same thing. Dickens' characters he always wrote from beginning to end, and he let this characters flow him to his plots. And so I thought it was quite an interesting way to do it.
It is fascinating. How about you, Vicky? How do you
I kind of got absorbed into the conversation.
How do you?
Rod's a writer. Vicky doesn't write. Vicky reads.
No, I was saying that's what I was saying. I admire all of you. I don't even know how you do that. I mean, that's why I was saying when he was talking about the Post-it notes, if I even began to even try to do what all of you do, I would probably have the wall covered, trying to figure out how to put like a puzzle, try to stick this, and that there. So I'm in total admiration of all of you. I mean, I really appreciate people that write books, because we really
Can I just say, apart from making a bloody good dry martini, I'm not much good at anything else, really. So
I can't even do that.
That's a skill, let me tell you.
You have to have a skill set, so there you are.
Well, if it's any consolation, I went to uni, I wanted to become the next best novelist, like, John Irving, who I admire deeply. I tried it, crap at it. Then I wrote a script, and next thing I know, I had a bunch of agents wanting to represent me. So I was like, okay, I'm okay when things are clinically. Yay, I'm a clinical writer. Yay. So it actually works quite good. But yeah, I think it takes a lot of talent to actually write a novel and making it flow and having everything.
I know. I'm just in awe of people that have that brain. I really am.
I have yet to find that magic combination or whatever it is. I mean, I've written 2 books and had one that was, the first one was self-published. Then I took it back and I rewrote it again, and it got published through an e-publishing company with Kindles, and there were paperbacks. It went absolutely nowhere. I made less off that novel than I did off an article that, my usual fee for articles. I feel that I live in Maine. This is Stephen King territory. I should be, absorbing some of what he's throwing off, but I think he's got, he definitely has prevented that from happening as far as I'm concerned.
You say it's not in the water.
It's what?
It's not in the water.
It's not in the water.
Well, I don't drink the water here. I'll drink. Well, I take that back. Poland spring water I will drink, and that is from Maine, so I do drink that.
I do have to say, Rod, I think that unfortunately, I think that when you wrote your book, and because Vicky knows, we used to have a literary agency that we used to represent authors at one point, and what we found basically, the industry went through this really weird boom. Self-publication. And so basically with the self-publication that anyone could publish the book, and they did, which unfortunately caused a lot of great stuff to get lost in the shuffle. Now things are kind of going back. So now that people self-publishing, though people are still kind of doing it, it's not at the forte anymore. Right. And so now it's come back to publishing, and it's kind of going back to that route at the moment. So things are. And unfortunately, when you're in the self-publishing side of things, and the only way that you can make money is you're going to have to market and merchandising this. And unfortunately, that is actually a minefield in itself. And it's really hard to do. I know. And I think that at the time that you published your book, I think you were kind of in the middle of that whole shift of everyone was self-publishing. And trust me.
Yes.
I was reviewing books at that time, and I saw some of the stuff that being self-published, and I was, lucky if any of it was spelled correctly.
It's crap.
But unfortunately, it did cause a dip in the whole publishing and what was noticed and stuff like this. But I think that now that you are entering that world again, that there are different avenues that you can go down that might make it a bit more fruitful for you.
Well, now I've got both of them finished and redone, and I'm just waiting for this wonderful new avenue to go down. But I have had more luck, as you guys know, with nonfiction, writing articles. I'm writing an article about The Exorcist right now, which I thought would be easygoing, but actually it's difficult. I don't know why it is difficult.
I thought that the book itself, or are we talking about the movie? Because I thought that was just so...
Well, I read the book. I didn't read the book until after I saw the movie, and I was rather shocked at how graphic the book was. So I could see how they couldn't make it the film like that. But I think what they did with the film is really, really good. It's a very good movie. Great performances.
I was too scared to see it. I've watched a bit of it and then had to hide behind the sofa, I think, when I was
raised Catholic. It always disturbs me.
Well, it's based on Vicky's childhood.
Basically, it is.
If you're Catholic, it means more, because you have to accept the idea that these priests have some kind of divine, ability to drive this, what is a demonic entity, out of her. I mean, it's not. You have to completely accept that, and the premise is that you will accept it. And I've seen things on YouTube where they showed the filming using her voice, Linda Blair's voice, as a demon, which was effective in its own way. It sounded like a little girl, but the things that she was saying were not little girl things, But they decided to go with a different voice, Mercedes McCambridge, which I think was inspired and inspire. That's the thing that you remember the most about the movie. Is
I
the
don't know
voice
if I
of
could
the
live with
demon.
that person that did that voice. Can you imagine if they screwed with you all the time?
Well, she was,
But she was a famous
she
actress.
was in Rebel Without a Cause.
Was she?
That's who. Yeah, she's James
No, she
Dean's
was in
mom,
Giant.
isn't she?
She was
Giant,
in,
yeah.
No, that was
Giant.
Anne Duran. Anne Duran
okay.
played. She was
Okay.
Rock Hudson's older sister in Giant, and
okay.
I always got the feeling she was actually the mother of James Dean's character. But she was in All the President's Men.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called? No,
She doesn't look like
not
the type of
President's
person
Men.
that could enunciate in that capacity.
Well, she
was a
I think
radio
from what I
actress.
read that she tied herself to a chair, and
Yes,
pretended
she
was getting
did.
tortured to come out with that voice or whatever.
I think.
Yeah,
I mean,
she put a raw egg in her mouth and downed it with some whiskey. I can
No,
only
don't
imagine
even.
what kind of reaction she got from that. But I'm just having a difficult time writing it because I try to infuse a certain amount of humor in my writing, and it's just not coming through in this film. You know,
It's not a humorous film, Rod.
But what you know, a good aspect, just throw it out there. It's actually based on a true case.
Right.
And there is a TV movie about the true case, and there is a bunch of stuff written about the true case, which might give you some reflection about how everything comes through. We covered The Exorcist in an early episode, and I'd sit there and say I didn't like the book at all. I thought the book was so badly written, but
It
I
was
thought
all
the
over the
movie
place.
was better.
It was everywhere.
Yeah.
I
I think it was good for its times. I think.
I think your idea about Vicky was saying about living with somebody, who can create that voice. I mean, asking them to pass the marmalade, and they talk to you like that. And it was just was making me think back to our discussion about Poe, because obviously he was too young. His parents died when he was 3, so he wouldn't have really known them. But there is a strong sense of theatricality in the writing, I think.
Yeah, there is.
Very much
and
so.
you just sort of wonder whether that's come, is there some sort of innate talent or appreciation of the theatre that's come through in his work. I just thought that was
good
quite
point.
interesting.
Good point about the theater. Yes, which makes me wonder: will millennials read Poe? I have a hard time.
I
getting
think
through
so, actually.
Millennials read.
I've actually seen a research that there are some kids out there and some people that do appreciate.
To be honest, Gothics, people who are into Gothic, either music or dress, they love Poe.
Oh,
they
the
really
goth
read Poe.
movement. Yes.
Yeah.
I can
And
see
that
why.
still goes strong, and there's still every once in a while it does gather up the mills and brings it in.
So they like the Brontes, like Mary Shelley. They like Bram Stoker.
And
I was at sorry. I had one of my book signings recently, and a chap came in, and he just had this extraordinary sort of greatcoat on, and a very unique look. And he was chatting away to me, and you guys might have heard this. I had never heard it before. He said he's part of the steampunk movement.
Oh yeah,
steampunk.
Steampunk, yes.
Fascinating. I mean, I'd never heard of it before. He was
I
telling
love
me about it.
steampunk stuff.
And yes, it was all a bit sort of. It was, H.G. Wells. It was Poe. This guy had even made what absolutely floored me. He'd got this incredible coat on that he'd actually made, and he was saying that there are sort of steampunk festivals, and there's that combination of futurism with Victoriana and Victorian goth. And it seemed to me an extraordinary thing. I quite fancy going to a festival.
What was that movie? Will Fraser's in it. I thought West was one. Didn't they do a redo with that, with the big machines? And
he did.
Well, it kind of reminds me of the Wild Wild West.
Got that too.
That's what
that's what I was trying to think
Victorian
of.
Science fiction twist to
Very
it.
steampunk.
That's pretty much what it is.
I'd never heard of it, and I did sort of think, wow, it just had such style,
I love their sunglasses. I live in Texas, so I have like sunglasses everywhere. So I love the steampunk sunglasses.
Dr. Miracle in the Rue Morgue is guilty of 4 murders so far this week, and by now perhaps a 5th.
So let's move on to Murders in the Rue Morgue, the 1932 film, which is an American pre-cult horror film based on the Edgar Allan Poe short story, The Murders of the Rue Morgue, which stars Bela Lugosi. 1 year after his performance as Dracula, portrays a lunatic scientist who abducts women and injects them with blood from his ill-tempered caged ape. The film was produced as a compensatory package for Lugosi and Florey after both were dropped from 1931's Frankenstein. Initially booked with a lower budget, the film's budget increased after the success of Universal had with Frankenstein, which led to additional scenes being shot and reshoots to be done in December 1931. On the film's release, it was not a huge film financially, but it did receive negative reviews from critics who commented variously on the acting and narrative. So, Rod, what are your thoughts of The Murder in the Rue Morgue?
Here we go.
Well, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen the film lately. I did watch it when it was shown on Svengoolie, which is a TV show in the U.S. where he hosts movies. And I had never seen it. I had never seen it before. My first impression was this is very slow, and they have taken just the basic premise of the story. Right. The story meaning a man who has an ape and the ape gets out and does naughty things. I mean, that was all it was. Now this man has an agenda. He likes to torture women, and when I say torture women, he'll put them up on a cross, if I remember, something like that, an X, but it was like a cross.
Didn't they borrow that from another film?
They at Black Cat, I think they reused it, didn't they?
Universal was into that. Universal was into these weird. In that time, a lot of that weird stuff.
It was a little risque, kind of. It
was risque.
I'm always fascinated by how much they got away with. But when I was a little girl watching, as we always say, monster movie matinee, it just went right over my head as a child.
They're the kind of things that once the child gets old enough, they start wondering about these things and want to ask questions about it. No one has any answers for them. So it really, the whole draw of the movie is Bela. So Bela has a lot of these great close-ups with the unibrow and
what was the deal with the unibrow, Rod?
I think just to make him look as different from the matinee idol look of Dracula as possible. That's what I think.
Oh, there you go.
That's true. I think I do think they had a really hard time with his accent. Personally, I find his accent enjoyable to listen to, and I don't have any trouble understanding him. But I guess in those days, people did. He was. Plus, I think there was a certain amount of suspicion from some people about these European types, that come from Spain or someplace like that, who want to woo women Hungary. and Hungary. And so there was this kind of like Rudolph Valentino, like the Latin lover or whatever, and so that came through, I think, in what they were doing with him in the movie. But once you know that this, and plus there's such an unconvincing ape. I've seen better apes on the Three Stooges.
Don't you like how they keep going back from the chimpanzee to the ape? And I mean,
to a man in a costume jumping up and down, going. I mean, it was just ridiculous. But then again, the audience.
Mighty Joe Young all over again.
Well, that was, I mean, if you can be fascinated by Mighty Joe Young, I'm not talking about from a technical viewpoint where you go, wow, that's great animation, okay, where you actually go in there and go, oh, I'm scared, this is a really big ape. Nobody feels that way now, not unless you're an infant. I mean, we're too sophisticated an audience for this anymore.
We are.
So therefore, when we watch a movie where it cuts from a real ape to a man in a costume, we know the difference. We can tell it's laughable. It becomes laughable, and you start to laugh at it as a curio. So I thought the movie was interesting as a curio, as a development in the Universal horror legacy that was building itself, at that point. It's a minor player, definitely a minor player, and only only famous for Bela Lugosi being in it, only notable for him.
Didn't you think the cinematography was kind of beautiful? Joe?
I thought that it looked beautiful. I think it's a beautifully filmed thing. It had that German expressionistic look about it, which I thought was really nice looking.
Well, they did that quite well.
I thought it
in other films too.
The atmosphere of Paris, in Victorian Paris, very well. It made me think of novels by sort of Emile Zola, for example, those dark, dank passages.
Yeah.
You know, with the sort of grime on the walls, and we see that Madame Lestrade, is that her name, where she with the no teeth sitting by the.
Yes.
I mean,
she knitted.
That's exactly. But yeah, there is real sort of atmosphere to it. But I think what you were saying about slightly risque. I mean, now, Rod, you'll know much more about this than I. But am I right in thinking that the films of the 30s were slightly less constrained because you had, Jean Harlow being very sexy and a bombshell. You got Mae West. But then it's more for the 40s and 50s where they got much more puritanical.
True.
The Hays Code came in.
Yeah. So I just wonder, because in this film, right at the beginning, there's this sort of slightly Egyptian dances. I'm doing some Egyptian dancing here, but you can't see me. But,
do they paint themselves? Do they paint themselves? What color they are? I mean, you cannot say that anymore.
No.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. In Hollywood in 1930s, everybody was kind of whiter than the Queen. So, so if you did want something that was a bit more exotic, then you tend to body paint your actors to fit that type sort of thing. Yeah. To put it as delicately as possible,
Right.
Yes.
Right. Which now,
I don't think it was Justin Trudeau area, but it's kind of the same thing.
Right. But it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue with modern day audiences who start judging. I have a real problem with that, where they say, well, like for instance, Song of the South, Disney's Song of the South. That's a classic film and the first movie to ever combine live action with animation, and they refuse to release it to DVD or video or to the movies because people have complained that it shows a benevolent relationship between an ex-slave and the ex-master, or something of that sort. And so, but yet Gone with the Wind they show all the time, and that shows that too.
Well, I think what you have, unfortunately, I think that when you get, and to be honest, if you look at normally the people who are making these kind of complaints are not the necessity of the people that they're complaining about. It tends to be extremely people who are kind of Caucasian and think they're doing the best thing for mankind, when in fact, it's a bit like it's a bit like this. It's like just to take it slightly, put it in context, but slightly off about films, take the word Christmas, that some religions find this offensive, so you shouldn't use Christmas. But when you go to here, where we have consoles, the people who are making these rules, it isn't the people who are not Christian that find it offensive. It's the people who are Christian because they think these other people are going to find it offensive. And that's pretty much what we have. So but unfortunately what happens is that when the people do make these references like, Song of the South and et cetera, what happens is that the reason why they're banned is always banned on the ethnicity that they're being complained about, thinking it's the ethnic race that's portraying, that's making the complaint, but it's not. It's some kind of do-gooder who really doesn't understand anything about facts, times of periods and stuff like this, and unfortunately that's what kind of clouds everything.
I think with all forms of art, we can't judge it from the position of our time. So we just can't. The world was completely different. And so it narrows us. I think we have to open ourselves up and say, well, this was what was considered normal at the time, and it's not going to be a block to my enjoyment of the novel or the people.
What a block! I just thought some of it was funny. The way you had this lily white woman and her big bonnet. She was, do you think they paint themselves like that? It's just.
But I mean, I think how you have to look at it. Simple fact that this is the time. This is how it was. You need to watch things because of that, because you need to learn and make sure this doesn't happen again.
Absolutely.
If you start obliviating this kind of stuff, then basically what's going to be honest is that you're not going to have a realistic version of past.
Correct.
So therefore, you're never going to be able to learn to make the future a better place.
I totally agree with that. But I don't know. I thought it was a fun film, though.
It was fun. Yeah, I mean, silly. It's silly, but
It
it's
is
fun.
very silly. I mean, Bela Lugosi with the unibrow and the Blanche Devereaux haircut from Golden Girls. I mean, you can't get any. You can't
I
get any.
know. I mean, what were they thinking? Even for 32, 34, was it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Interestingly enough, this script was written by John Huston.
no
Really?
kidding.
Yeah.
Oh.
And the lead actress was supposed to be played by Bette Davis, but
Wasn't
Carl
sexy
Lamar
enough.
Jr. turned her down because he didn't think that she had enough sex appeal.
Yep, she wasn't sexy enough.
Wow. She's my favorite, I think, of all time.
I read that too. Wasn't she supposed to appear in Frankenstein as well?
Yeah.
As Henry's wife in the very first one. No, it was May Clark, but it was Bette Davis who was first cast in that.
I think
To be
Bette
honest-
Davis would have been brilliant in this. Maybe tell
Well,
you the truth.
to be honest, I think she might have been a bit disconcerting in it because you kind of would have watched her, and I think that unfortunately because of Sidney Fox and everyone in this, I have to sit and say it's not the best acting in the world. And Sidney Fox was
maybe.
for someone who's supposed to be in love with the female, his relationship with his Rue was real.
I know. He had a nagging wife for a date. I mean,
Well, to be honest, they work better as a gay couple than him going out with her because
Yeah, they
she
would.
just sounded like basically it was like him and his fag hag. That's what it looked like.
That's
Yeah.
quite
And,
right. I think Bette Davis would have been too good for this movie.
yeah.
But
would have been. But it would have been fun.
She probably would have buried it at the day if she was in this movie.
Well, she was just starting out. She was just starting out, and eventually, as her career, and they kept re-releasing these films, she would become, by the time they stopped re-releasing them, which was in the 50s, she was already a major movie star.
True.
So how would they promote her in this film? Starring Bette Davis, also featuring Colin Clive, and her role lasts 5 minutes. The only part I can remember is where Frank the monster breaks into her boudoir and scares her.
I like where they
Remember
shoved the woman up the chimney, though. They did stick to that,
Yeah, they did stick. I was
They
quite
did.
shocked when the
violence.
woman comes, her headless body starts, and it's kind of like when you get a really quick glance. Because the thing is, I watched it on Amazon Prime, and I rewound it a little bit and did it slowly, and basically her head is just kind of like off her neck. So I thought, oh, okay, this is a bit risque. I just wasn't expecting this.
That was quite shocking.
Okay,
And
let's get to the meat of the story, though. Let's think about it. We all want to know, why was he killing these women, trying to get their blood samples for his...
I think he was impregnated because if it was about, I'm sorry, but if it was about mixing human bloods with apes, I don't think you just need women to do that. That's me. I know. I think for me, I think what happened was basically that was the original story. And they probably thought, well, we can't do that because we can't have, animal human sex going on here, bestiality. We can't sit there and allude to bestiality. So we'll just change this little small fact in it. Which,
You're right.
because to be honest,
they
they were trying for bestiality, or they couldn't get away with it.
But he did.
Well,
But
in a way-
that doesn't explain why he needed the perfect blood, But so, what if there wasn't no bestiality going on at this
Let's
point?
take the blood out of it. Let's say that he needed the perfect egg. Now everything makes sense.
Okay.
Right?
That's kind of along the lines of Island of Lost Souls, which also was around that time period, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, and
it
they
was.
also showed the hint of bestiality. I mean, turning beasts into humans, especially gorgeous women. Supposedly
Women have
with the
come
soul
such
of
a
a
long
tiger.
way since those days of film.
Wow.
I
have to
love
say
Bela
this,
Lugosi, by the way.
Well, I have to the structure. The structure of the film is a kind of bizarre kind of film. I think, to be honest, this film would have been more successful if it stuck more closely to the book.
Yeah.
Because what you kind of had this love story that's unbelievable, which I know that's very important. If you're going to do a Hollywood movie, you got to have some kind of love interest going on here. But I think that the reason why and I'm not great, as we discussed earlier, I'm not a fan of the source material. There's a lot of it that I really admire, but here I think the short story works because there is no love interest, and basically you have these two ordinary aristocratic, as ordinary as an aristocratic Victorian person can be, but being interesting in solving a crime. And I think that if the movie stuck more to that, where basically you had like a Sherlock Holmes kind of a character with his sidekick coming in and hearing about the murders and actually not taking out the women, just having the murder victim, solving this crime for an hour, I think would have made a more interesting movie. And the thing is, you could have made Bela Lugosi, you could actually have him as the eccentric person coming in to solve the murder, or as the eccentric sidekick.
Well, actually, that would have been more interesting. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and it would have made it more. But I think I think that this movie suffers because of Dracula and Frankenstein. Because when Dracula and Frankenstein is okay, we need a monster. So we need a monster character. So Bela Lugosi needs to be a monster character. And I think that's probably what ruined the story.
Well, he got kind of pigeonholed into that after Dracula.
Because I can tell you, the person who directed this, Robert Florey. Now the thing is, if you're a fan of the 1930s Dracula with Bela Lugosi, you would also know that they took the sets and made a Spanish version at the same time they were filming the Bela Lugosi. They were filming a Spanish version, which was done by Robert Florey.
Did not know that.
Which basically was a lot more interesting to look at visually, and the acting's a lot better.
Is that hard to find? That's fascinating.
If you buy the Blu-ray of Dracula, it comes with it for free. If you get the DVD of the 1930s, it's really, really good. And it's all done in Spanish, and it's very interesting, and it has a fantastic look. And so what we get here is we do get Robert Florey's fantastic way of looking at things, the shadowing, the German impressionistic way of looking at things. And we do get the hint of basically of what's not being said. And Robert Florey is very good at that. And that's what we get. Unfortunately, we have a weak script with weak acting. But if we had a good script with him directing with strong acting, this movie would probably go down in history as one of the greatest universal horror films of all time.
And as a fact, it isn't, yes. So, but I mean, I still very much enjoyed it. I mean, it was silly, but it was atmospheric. And actually, I just love the movies from the 30s anyway.
So do I. I'm so with you.
I love them. I mean, I love Jean Harlow. I love all of that period. I prefer the sort of screwball comedies, if I'm honest. But it was still fascinating. And I watched it this morning. So actually, bloody nice way to pass the morning, I can tell you, with a big cup of tea.
I have to sit there and say it is one of those kind of Sunday morning kind of things where you just have a cup of tea and let it wash over you. Yeah. What I did like about the film is that the first half hour I thought it was kind of bland, but by the second half hour I actually was interested. So it did. So I think if you get past the first half hour, it's like, because the first half hours, I think it's the acting for me that kind of Sidney Fox was too. I'm sorry, but he's too effeminate for me. I don't know why. I think if we had some like a dashing, good-looking, guy like a Cary Grant kind of good looks kind of thing or whatever, and then had the story, we might have gone a little bit further. But yeah,
wasn't Leon Ames in that? Leon Ames is in that too, right?
What's the actor? Sorry, let's look at my notes.
Yes, as Pierre Dupin.
He's an actor that I always associate with a father role, like in Me in St. Louis and several other movies where he's always played the father. So I think wasn't he a young romantic lead in this film? It's been a while since I've seen it.
He was. Yeah, he was Paul, wasn't he? So yeah, he was.
Do you guys do you remember the three people arguing over what language they heard? Was it German? It was Italian. Or I can't remember.
Danish.
Yeah, you always have those.
I have to say, it did remind me of French and Saunders, where they go, "Are you going to do the accent?" Because none of them were actually doing the accent. And you're like, "Are you going to do the accent or not?" You got someone doing like a French accent, and then you got someone doing an American accent, and of course, if you're in these films, anyways, we've noticed that if you're got money and you're a bit educated, you have an English accent. So we had that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, sadly, yes, that's true.
If you're the everyman, you had the American accent, and if you wanted a bit exotic, they had
But
like
it's
this.
not true now, so that's good.
Yeah.
It's funny because
Isn't it just?
I remember.
I think it is still today.
Yeah, that's how they sound. When the first time I saw Star Wars, my sister goes, "Why do all the villain guys? Why are they British?" And I said, "Well, I think probably because they filmed in Britain."
I'd like to put something in there. I think we do make good villains, the Brits, actually.
You do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Look at Die Hard.
Yeah, they're always British.
Yeah, Die Hard. But Darth Vader is not British, though. Darth Vader isn't.
Do you know my father was a stand-in for Darth Vader?
No way.
Was he really?
Oh, yeah. But they weren't renowned actors in any way. My father was an actor and a singer, really. He used to do lots of theatre. But he was very tall. He was 6'4". And so my mother had left him at this point, so I wasn't sort of living with him at the time as a child. But yeah, he was a stand-in for Darth Vader.
No kidding.
I mean, Darth Vader was. I mean, as far as Darth Vader, the voice is concerned, that was dubbed in way after the film was finished.
Yeah. This
it wasn't James Earl Jones, wasn't it?
Right.
Yeah, it was James Earl Jones. Yes. But Peter Cushing was the one who was. Peter Cushing was in the first movie, and he was the one that was commanding
the
Vader. He was with the Death Star, and I grew up. Well, we all grew up on Hammer films. I mean, that's all we watched. So I used to watch these things. I go, oh, I'd love to go over to England. I'd love to see all those monsters that they have over there because they don't have anything over here. All they had was giant bugs and things like that.
What's so funny is that you guys you're talking about the Hammer films, and obviously we had those.
Oh yeah, the Hammer films, yes.
But we have such. I was born in 1961, so I'm 58, and what I remember most from television was American television. Abbott and Costello. I mean, they're obviously old at the time. Laurel and Hardy. I mean, just.
Oh yeah, that's pretty funny.
We just absolutely adored them, and I
think they're. But again, in 1960s and 70s British cinema, there are some great gems that are kind of lost now, like Georgie Girl and A Taste of Honey.
Taste of Honey, yeah.
And anything with Beryl Reid in it was always fantastic. Or Margaret Rutherford and all those stuff.
Wasn't she in The Killing of Sister George? Wasn't she?
Yeah, The Killing of Sister George. But then you also got, Margaret Rutherford. I mean, she was probably the best Miss Marple ever.
Margaret Rutherford, yes.
And they kind of get lost now, though. Some of these old British things. I mean, luckily, Hammer Horror stays very much alive, which is a really good thing. But there's also all these other stuff that was playing at the time, and I think sadly they kind of getting lost now.
Like the St. Trinian films, they were fun.
Oh yeah, St. Trinians.
I love St. Trinians.
St. Trinians, oh my! I've seen that had Alistair Sims in it, didn't it?
Yeah.
Alistair Sims is one of our favorites. All the Ealing comedies we had, they were one.
Oh yeah, I have the Ealing box set on Blu-ray now, and it's like
yeah,
and that's fantastic. And An Inspector Calls, one of the best detective films ever made. So
yeah. Well, aren't we lucky to have, this one? We live in a wonderful time. We've had this sort of rich culture of wonderful films and books around us. We're very lucky.
I think we're very lucky to grow up when we did, because I think the generation today misses out the simple fact that they can pick and choose what they want. Where I think that we're a bit more richer because we had only a few stations to look at, so we kind of were forced to watch what everyone else is watching, which I think has influenced us a lot better.
And it had quality to it, I think.
Yeah.
Well, when you
have a BBC, channel ITV, and Channel 4, and everyone's together, you watch and they used to show stuff from every single era, which was quite nice.
Well,
remember $1 Million movie? I remember watching that every Sunday.
In those days, I sound like I'm 100 years old, but in those days, in my younger days, I walked 50 miles to school barefoot. I mean,
In
I
the
actually
snow.
did walk to school in a ton of snow. Keith did too.
a ton of snow, yes. A ton of snow.
Ton
They
of
never
snow.
canceled school.
Wow.
But the truth of the matter is that there was certain things that you could own, like Murders in the Rue Morgue, for example. That's not the kind of movie that would just appear on a regular basis on TV. You have to scour the TV guides and whatever else you can
Yeah,
use.
for sure. But there was
Oh,
a couple other movies that, well, there was one with Jason Robards. I actually watched that one too, where they incorporated this story into another story. I don't know if you watched that one, Rod. I imagine you probably did.
I did watch that a long time ago. I think I saw that at the movies, at the cinema. I did see the one with Carl Malden in it, where he gave his victims. He had the ape, and he'd give them like a little necklace or a bracelet that had bells ringing on it, and that would infuriate the ape. And they had the woman shoved
That's
up the...
right. That's
Don't
right.
infuriate an ape. Do not want to piss off an ape ever.
No, you do
As
not.
a policy, I think you should abide by that.
I know. Look what happened to Fay Ray.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, don't poke the bear.
She was
Hey,
quite the
Ray.
screamer, though. Out of all the movies I've ever seen, past, present, whatever, no matter what era they were made, she had the best screaming going on.
Well, she certainly did, and she pounded on the face of Lionel Atwell that we had to assume was wax all the way through the entire movie, including lips that could move and eyes that could blink, and she smashes his face and it falls off and he's a monstrosity underneath it. Do you know what movie that was? You know, right? Mystery of the Wax Museum?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they did the same scene in House of Wax with Vincent Price. She pounds him in the face and it breaks his mask.
Yeah.
And all the way through, he's been wearing an immobile wax mask.
Yeah.
That's a suspension of disbelief right there. Kind of like the idea of an ape, impregnating a woman or whatever.
But it's like my mother always told me, it's just a movie. You know, it's Hollywood. It's not supposed to be believable.
Oh yeah.
It's real. It was a documentary that you just watched. Get over it. So, on that note, let's talk about our final thoughts. So, what are your final thoughts of the book by Edgar Allan Poe, the short story, and the film? And we'll start with you, Rod. What are your final thoughts?
Well, I thought the movie was very hokey and somewhat stagey because of the era in which it was produced. For what it was a fun story, and it went by very quickly. But it really wasn't the story of Murders in the Rue Morgue. They just took the nugget of it, which are the actual murders, and built a completely different story around it. The actual story now, the short story, was a bit of a slog to get through at the beginning. But then when they got into the meat of the matter, which was to determine what the killer was, who the killer was, why it was there, I say it because it does turn out to be an it, and how, more than anything, it got in and out without any evidence of an egress or an outgress, I guess is what they called it, or ingress. Right. Egress or ingress is something like that. There was no proof of it, so this man took us very methodically through the entire thing. It was fascinating to watch, even though there are some holes in the story. But that he was the father of the American detective story, is that what they claim he is, or is it just detective stories overall?
It was like one of the first detective stories.
Yeah.
I believe it was actually.
It was very interesting. But I will tell you that the only reason why I read it is because I knew about the horrific murders. And when I was a kid, I loved gore. So I would read that, and it was very gory. I mean, he continuously goes back to talking about how gory it is. And, look at this. It appears that hair has been yanked out, from the skull, but also part of the scalp came along with it. See it? It was pretty gross, actually, reading that again.
I think the idea of we get shocked or distressed or whatever by very bloodthirsty scenes, grisly scenes, but of course we've got to remember that in the 19th century, death was all around, all of the time. I mean, how many children died in infancy, women in childbirth? There was poverty, chronic poverty, lack of sanitation, so that every family would have had family members that have died, and it would just be, they'll have another baby, or it's just one of those things. So in a way, when Poe was writing, because death was such a constant companion to everybody, he had to sort of up the ante, I suppose. So an 8 would do it. I reckon an 8 would up the ante.
Yes, it would up the ante. I mean, just by diseases alone, like something like what we're experiencing now, that we have cured, like smallpox and things like that, that would kill people.
Yeah, absolutely.
The plague and all that, the Black Plague.
I think that's quite an interesting aspect to it. I mean, in the film, for example, do you remember the chap, the flatmate or whatever he is cooking? Is it macaroni? And I was looking at it thinking, oh my God, he probably hasn't washed his hands for a week and a half.
Some form of noodles.
COVID, yay!
Yeah, that happened quite a bit. That kind of stuff happened quite a bit. Oh God!
I don't think they had running water, did they?
No, they wouldn't have. No sanitation at all. I mean, well, you think parts of the world now where there isn't. What was the French say? They used to say "gardez-le" when they chucked their
throw it out the window.
Out the window, and hope, dear God, if you were walking by, you'd have to skedaddle, wouldn't you?
Well, that was like that in England as well. I mean, basically,
Victorian England there was no in London, all those sort of rank passages, loads of little lanes, and which are still, you can still walk down today, where there would be 40 people living in sort of shacks. I mean, just unthinkable really today.
And another thing is when you look at moats for sewage. So when you see this fantastic knight trying to save his maiden fair, he's swimming over towards her, and he gives her a great big kiss on the lips.
Swimming over in a river of shit.
Kissing tree with every smooch. There we are.
I don't think their nose. I'm hoping that their noses didn't work back then, because it must have been pretty horrendous.
Oh no, they
must
did.
Have just gotten used to it, I imagine.
Well, it wasn't no better over here, that's for sure. I mean, in the early days when they were, if they ever saw a bar of soap, the soap would run away from them. I mean, it was literally like that. I mean, and they'd get into a bathtub, and it was always, one of these tubs, it looked like a wash
that
tub.
everybody had used prior.
Yes, everybody.
Yeah, but you also have to remember, as far as clothing is concerned, you had one suit, and that's what you wore every day. So
imagine what that's not like.
Well, what about when they wore the wigs and all that stuff?
Oh, Marie Antoinette and the mice in the wigs.
Yeah, mice and
they
roaches
never washed
in the
their
wigs.
face. They just put makeup on their faces over and over and over again.
Yeah, I just can't imagine
Jane.
being that dirty, because I'm like one of those. I mean, I'll shower twice a day sometimes. I'm just weird that. It's like,
well, think about it.
Yeah, you can shower once a day because you can shower once a day. But back then, it's just like,
but I just can't.
If you want to take a bath, you had to go down by the river, bring up buckets of water, and while you're doing that, you're probably beating your clothes against the rock. So they were the good old days. They're so bad, But the way things are going, we might go back to that. You never know.
So.
Well, you see a lot.
God, don't say that.
You see a lot of that in Dickens.
Yeah, crikey, yeah, absolutely. But I mean, one of my final thoughts about both the story and the film is our abiding interest in detective stories. I mean, that book was written nearly 200 years ago, and it's extraordinary how today's TV, and I'm very glad as a writer, I'm delighted the detective stories are still there, but 200 years practically down the line, we all still love a detective story. So we've got to thank you for that, haven't we?
Yeah, and
well, that's why we like Columbo so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's because it kind of keeps your mind working, I mean, everybody likes their romance and this and that, and I get it, but a detective story always kind of sucks you more in, because who did do it, and why did this happen, and you question, then you keep flipping pages. That's what's so great about them.
It really is.
I mean, for me, I think that it's quite interesting. I think this is a museum piece. As far as the film goes, I didn't like the film. I probably will never watch this film ever again. For me, it was quite a good museum piece, and I love the way it was filmed, but beyond that, I probably won't even look at this film again, and I'm glad I didn't buy a copy. I'm glad I streamed the copy. Now, as far as the short story is concerned, I think that it's very, very interesting that we are seeing the it's like the Adam and Eve of the detective story.
Yeah,
and we're
that's good.
seeing the bare bones that basically are improved upon, which now the detective story or the murder story or solving a murder is part of our everyday lives. We have it no matter, even in a modern time, we have it, you know, with your own books, Angela, with, you know, you do your suburban contemporary comedy murder mysteries. We have those. We have CSI. We had every documentary that you're watching on Netflix that deals with a murder is done in the same kind of format that Poe is the originator of.
Absolutely.
You know, whether you know, James Patterson would be nowhere without Poe.
Exactly.
You know,
Absolutely.
and so and that's what I quite like about this is like, yeah, there's parts the beginning of the story I found it a bit tough going, but once we got into the story, and yeah, there are holes in the plots, and yes, there are things that don't quite come together, but this is kind of like the first car, or the first airplane that, you know, Wilbur and Wright were flying. Basically, yeah, okay, it went a couple feet and then it kind of crashed, but this is the beginning of something. But this is the beginning of something great.
And also,
and we're
unless the writer's writing, you know, very much a forensic story, I think there is such a thing as poetic license. We do when we read fiction, we are going in knowing that we are suspending disbelief a little bit. Yeah. And you know, if everything made absolute sense and logical sense all the time in fiction, it wouldn't be interesting. It wouldn't be fun. I have to say though, I think that with Poe, I mean, I think he did a fantastic job because let's be honest, you couldn't just go to Google and start Googling the stuff. You know, and because if you look at Poe's living in Baltimore at the time that he's writing the story, and he's producing this story that's set in Paris. And so therefore he has to use his memories. Therefore he has to use, you know, and he's basically putting stuff together out of his own imagination, and it does work on that. If you think of that, we're unlike Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes. Basically, you know, you could tell that the people that he was writing were basically people that he knew, as people that he was living with, as people that were neighbors, and they were all kind of, and that circle of people involved in that group of circles about how he wrote, and the people that Sherlock Holmes. So every time Sherlock Holmes would investigate a crime, you know that Arthur Conan Doyle knew something of the world that Sherlock Holmes was in.
Exactly.
So, you know, so when you look at that, I think Poe did a fantastic job as far as that. I think his hats have to go off.
It's been fascinating, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you guys. I've loved it.
I love having you. You're
too.
Totally engaging. You're like so far one of my favorite guests.
Let's do this again.
I'd love to. Please do invite me. I would love to. And we were talking about Bette Davis earlier. If you ever do Now Voyager, my favorite film of all time.
Why will pinch you in for that?
So what? Say that again about your favorite movie. What did you say?
Now
Voyager.
Bette Davis.
Oh, Now Voyager is my favorite Bette Davis movie.
Well,
I like how you called her Bette Davis.
I love it.
I like how you call her Bette Davis. Because I heard that on Are You Being Served? Believe it or not, they called Bette Davis Bette Davis.
I don't know why we say Bette here. Maybe. I'm probably wrong. He was American.
She said that she said that her mother was supposed to be Betty because her name is Elizabeth. Her real name is Elizabeth, but she said that it got misspelled somehow. But it's still pronounced the same way, except when she goes to England. They call her Bette.
Yeah, Bette Davis. What about
BBC calls her Bette.
Bette.
Now we have Bette Davis and
we have Bette Midler. We have Bette Midler. So
well, I was just going to say my other favorite Bette, who I adore, Bette Midler. Adore her.
Bette Midler's great. Yeah, she's great. I did want to ask you about Now Voyager. Why is that your favorite?
Well, it's deeply romantic. I love, you know, the final lines, you know, why wish for the stars when we have...
Oh, that's a great scene. That's a great scene.
But it's also...
I love how
the rebelliousness of her. There she is, that plain, spinsterish... I'm trying to think of the actress that plays her domineering mother. She was a marvellous actress.
Gladys Cooper.
Gladys Cooper. Dear Glad, yes. And just how...
she was horrid.
The metamorphosis... she's so good. The metamorphosis of the character and the physical change. I mean, I think that's one of the first films where you do see a heroine kind of come out of her chrysalis And her strength and the affair with a married man, it's just so dramatic. I loved it.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to watch it now. Oh my God!
I love how they have the scene at the very end, and they both blow cigarette smoke in each other's faces. I thought that was kind of funny.
I don't smoke. I've never smoked, but my God, it made me want to. It's just adorable. It's lovely.
I have to tell you this little aside about that movie. The first Bette Davis movie I ever saw, my sister took me to see Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Oh. And I had never laid eyes on Bette Davis before, or Joan Crawford. I didn't know who they were. But my mother had told me that they were both, in their day, big movie stars, okay? So I went to see this movie, and I will tell you that Bette Davis scared me spitless in that film when I first saw it. So one day I was coming home from church on a Sunday morning, and my older sister was watching a movie on TV, and I said, "What movie is this?" And she said, "Now Voyager." So I sat down on the couch, and I started watching it, and I go, "Who's that actress?" And she goes, "That's Bette Davis." And I was shocked. I could still remember saying, "That's Bette Davis," because she was beautiful in the film, and so ugly as Baby Jane. There was only 20 years in between them. On top of that, did you know that? There's only 20 years between that movie and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
I knew that her career took a nosedive because she got a certain age, but the American fantastic piece that you had a couple of years ago that we saw here about 2 years ago, Feud, based on
I love the Feud.
I mean, yes. I just thought it was one of the best things I've ever seen. I was in love with it.
I watched that too. That was about 2 years. They never had another one.
As we bid adieu to all our fans out there with the Literary License Podcast, before we go, Angela, how can people find you on the internet?
Hello. Well, you can find me. I'm Angela Dyson, the author of the Love Detective series. So far, there's 2 in the series, The Love Detective and The Love Detective Next Level. It's available in bookstores when they're open and when we're not in quarantine. And obviously it's available on all platforms, everything from Amazon to Kobo and all of those things. And I am busy writing book 3 in the series when I can concentrate, when these times aren't so terrible, which is going to be The Love Detective In Deep. And I hope people enjoy them. They are a kind of hybrid between a thriller and comedy, with two characters that I love, 2 fantastic women, a young woman in her 20s who's not the badass she'd like to imagine she is, and a rather marvelous flamboyant woman of 70 who's elegant and charismatic and pure.
Great.
I look forward to reading it.
Thanks.
And what we'll do is we'll make sure that the links to keep in contact with Angela Dyson are in our show notes, and they will be below the show. So this brings us to an end of our first episode of this month of Elementary, My Dear. The next episode we'll be doing will be The Lodger from 1942, starring George Saunders, and the Time After Time from the 80s, starring H.G. Wells and Malcolm McDowell as H.G. Wells with Murray. It's called Time After Time.
Y'all know what he means, people.
Sorry, it's been a long week. And they both deal with Jack the Ripper in 2 very interesting ways. Of course, our next Edgar Allan Poe will be part of our Death and End month, which will be Tales of Terror, which is basically, will be incorporating 3 Edgar Allan stories: The Black Cat, Morella, The Cask of the Bella, I'm sorry, people, and The Facts in the Case of the Tales of Terror is the 1962. There we go. And of course, it's the Literary License Podcast. And of course, you can find us on most of our social media. Make sure that you sign up for our newsletter at www.llpodcast.com and sign up to our subscription. And remember, if you send us a picture of your cat, you too can win a Literary License Podcast hoodie. And we want to thank the 3 winners of this month. And your hoodies have been sent to you, and you should receive them by the 15th of April, courtesy of ourselves. We also like to sit there and thank all the people who have been joining up to our podcast. And I want to thank my 800 brand new friends who've all joined on to Facebook. So remember that you can find us also on our social media, which includes Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Tumblr,
reviews, of course, go to our website, or you can go to our Goodreads page, or alternatively, you can go to our Tumblr site that has all our book reviews on there as well. You can also hear us on various formats, the format that you're listening to, or we're also available on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Cashbox Radio, YouTube, and various other favorite platforming stations. So remember to tune into us next week for Time After Time in the Lodger, and it's the Literary License Podcast, and it's good night for me. Good night, Rod.
Good night.
Good night, Vicky.
Good night, everybody. Take care of each other.
And good night to our special guest co-host, Angela Dyson. Good night, Angela.
Good night, and to all of you.
This has been a Literary License Podcast production. Good night.